All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show Emily Ekins, Vice President and Director of Polling at the Cato Institute. Welcome to Free the Economy, Emily.
Thank you for having me.
So I saw that you released the 2025 Fiscal Policy Poll recently. A lot of great questions and answers on there, and it's got some fascinating results. But I think maybe the most dramatic finding for me was the one in which Americans say the federal government wastes 59 cents on the dollar of every dollar it raises. Were you surprised by that number?
Yes, we all should be. Maybe some people aren't surprised, but it is surprising that people think that 60% of what the government spends is wasted. Now, put this into perspective. Gallup began asking this question in 1979. Back then, Americans thought the government wasted 40 cents on the dollar, which is still a lot, still very high. But now it's increased, almost 20 cents. And if you look at actual federal spending over the past several decades, it actually maps on. Federal spending has increased a lot. Per person, adjusted for inflation over the past several decades. And we asked Americans in the survey if they've noticed. Has that improved their lives? So specifically, we said federal spending has increased per person, adjusted for inflation, 25% over the past decade. Has this improved your quality of life? Have made no difference, reduced your quality of life? We found 85% says it has had no improvement on their quality of life. And so you have to ask, what did we get for all of that money spent?
Well, yeah, and I think it's interesting that um, the there's a long history of Americans being skeptical of big government, big spending government, and the ability to spend money wisely, the expectation, and you know, we have, the poll finds, 89% of people favor auditing the federal government, so they obviously that person, almost all Americans, right? Almost 90% feel that there's at least enough potential fraud that we need this big, a big sort of audit kind of process. And 76% say the government spends too much money. Um, and so those are huge super majorities, much bigger than the percentage of Americans who would describe themselves as libertarians or small government conservatives, right? Or even right of center in any
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
So there's obviously a percentage of Americans out there who would be left, center left, uh, the people who you would normally would say would be associated with favoring more federal spending, um, who nevertheless are sort of suspicious of the ability of the government to spend money well. And I was thinking about this, and I sort of was trying to think back in my sort of amateur political historian armchair here about how many presidential campaigns have made this an issue, including among Democrats. Plenty of Democrats have said, well, we're going to get rid of waste, fraud, and abuse as well. And so if you go all the way back to 1932, when FDR was running for president for the first time, um, just before the New Deal was launched, even then, the Democratic National Campaign called for, quote, an immediate and drastic reduction of government expenditures. They wanted to cut the government by as much, specifically the federal budget by as much as 25%, right? That's even more than Elon Musk and Doge are saying they're going to cut the federal government. So I think it's interesting to me, even though it's often taken as a sort of left versus right issue where people on the right are big for smaller government, people on the left are for bigger government. You've got a huge chunk of people, even people on the center left, who nevertheless have this sort of deep skepticism, and it makes me wonder, you know, is that should the lesson we be taking that from that is a sort of a negative one, saying people say they want smaller government, but yet we have huge government deficits, or should we say that we should look at that optimistically and say, well, there's at least some base to build on if we do want to trim government budgets in the future.
Yeah, no, it's complicated. I think this is why, I think at the root of this is this concept of concentrated benefits and dispersed costs. So Democrats, Republicans, Independents in our survey all agree that spending is too high. Put this in perspective, so of all Americans, they think 59 cents on the dollar of every federal dollar spent is wasted. Democrats thought it was 50, half. half of all government spending is wasted. Of course, Republicans were like in the 80, 90 cent range or so. But the point is you're right. Democrats, Republicans, independents all agree this is a problem. Why can it not be fixed? And I think that it would be helpful to have, an institutional scholar on here to really kind of get into the mechanics. But part of it, I think, is this idea of concentrated benefits and dispersed costs. And what that means is that people who are the recipient of government funding, contracts, grants, they have a lot to gain from that government spending. But the people who pay for it are the taxpayers, and it's dispersed. So how much did you pay for, Sesame Street in Iran? That, one of those USAID contracts. You personally didn't spend that much for that particular program, but the people who would lose funding for it, they will organize. They will argue vociferously for it. They'll get the media on their side. And therefore, it's been argued by my colleague, Romina Baccia, that we really need to have a BRAC style commission that has been authorized by Congress to get spending under control. Because right now, members of Congress, they don't want to take responsibility for the necessary spending cuts that will have to happen. I mean, think about what's happened to Elon Musk's reputation. If you look at the polling, people used to love him. He was the golden child of the political left. Now his favorability is underwater, and it's because he's trying to cut government. And so he's getting all of this negative press. And so this is the reason that if you want to cut government, you really have to have the president and Congress basically authorize a separate commission to cut the spending and take the blame that Congress and the president don't want to take.
Well, yeah, that the BRAC idea is interesting. I think we've definitely mentioned that a couple times before on the show at some point. Going back to the just people who aren't familiar with that, going back to the end of the Cold War, we had this idea in the United States that since we aren't fighting the Cold War against the Soviet Union anymore, we can cut military spending and including shutting down certain military bases. But the problem was domestic military bases are always in some senator's state and they're always in some congressman's district. And so they would fight very hard because they wouldn't want them to be closed because they wouldn't want people in their district to lose jobs, even if it's really strategically the best thing. Right. If it's really the smart thing to do, and everyone who has some distance from it can say that's the smart thing to do, but there'll be really strong opposition from the specific people affected. And so they put together the Base Realignment and Closure Commission, and the idea was that they would bundle a bunch of these unpalatable decisions all in one big pile, and so everyone could vote for the pile and say, we're doing the right thing, we're doing this, we're making the smart move. And you couldn't be blamed for closing the base in your district because it was 10 different decisions all bundled together. It was a lot easier to sort of politically digest that. And I've heard over the years people propose a sort of BRAC style commission for X, Y, and Z for a bunch of different things. And I think most of them probably would have worked if they had been implemented. But it takes a little institutional design, like you said, a sort of institutional expert would have to figure out just the right way to draw those rules about how the process would work in order for the effect to come out. But I think the being able to do the right thing while dodging the short-term political heat for doing something people don't like probably is a pretty good strategy.
Yeah. I mean, I heard a really interesting story a little while back. I want to be careful to, keep it anonymous, but essentially someone that was high ranking in one of the federal agencies revealed to me that their agency tried to cut their budget by almost half, a little more than half, drastically reduce their budget. And Congress kept giving them more money than they had even received the year before. They're like, no, you're not understanding us. We want less money, like half the money that we got last year. We
Mhm.
don't need this much money. And Congress kept giving it to them. And I asked, why is that? And they said, look, Congress, they want the contracts going to special interest groups in their districts. And
Mhm.
so even when the people within the agency wanted to reduce its scope and asked for 50% less money, Congress said, no, we're going to give you more money and like we're going to increase your budget. And this is how we end up in the situation where there's so much waste, fraud, and abuse that, and according to our survey, Let's see, 76% of Americans say we spend too much, and 98% said that they thought there was at least some waste, fraud, and abuse in the government federal budget.
Yes, I saw the numbers for people who don't think there needs to be any budget or any review of government spending at all, and it was like 2%. And I was like, I want I want a town hall, a CNN town hall special with only people in that 2%, so we can ask them questions about why we think there's absolutely nothing that needs to be investigated about federal spending. Um, so so when it comes to questions about about how we shrink the deficit, it's good questions. What is the way out of all this? Um, the results from the poll seem to say that Americans are pretty clear about their preferred method, right? Only 5% would want to balance the budget with only tax increases, but about half would be happy to do it with all spending cuts, with everyone else somewhere in the middle, some mix of spending cuts and tax increases. But we certainly would prefer to cut our way rather than tax our way out of the deficit if given the opportunity. Um, so Americans are sort of generally allergic to balancing the budget with tax cuts, but with one big exception. If we want to raise taxes on the rich or wealthy households, as it's sometimes called, that is generally much more popular, right?
That is true. And that's always the problem is that when tough decisions have to be made and trade-offs, that is what government's all about, trade-offs. And we pretend like it's not on this podcast, of course. You understand trade-offs. But when it comes to that, people think that the easy way out, the scapegoat, is like, oh, just tax the rich, tax the wealthy, or we'll lift the cap on Social Security taxes and we'll solve all. But that does not solve the problem. Even if you lifted all of those taxes, it does not solve the problem and it doesn't take into account all of the problems that ensue by raising taxes on the job creators and the businesses in this country. And so, yes, but that is true. While many people said, sure, one of the tools in the toolkit would be to raise taxes on the so-called wealthy, they also understand that when you say raised corporate taxes, that's going to hurt jobs and hurt businesses and drive them overseas. That's been a topic of conversation where people are saying, maybe we should bring people back, bring jobs and wages back to the US. You don't get that by raising taxes on the job creators. But I think more encouragingly, is that when we did ask, where should the balance be between raising taxes and cutting spending to deal with a $36 trillion debt and the $2 trillion a year deficit? Really, it was on the spending cut side. So, two-thirds or more, maybe three-fourths actually said they wanted to cut spending only or primarily cut spending and maybe a little bit on the tax increase side. Because I think a lot of people inherently know that you can't tax your way to prosperity and you can't tax your way out of this hole that we're in. And that given the level of just wasteful spending projects that have come to light. I mean, think about over the past month or so. As much as people are upset with Doge and upset with Musk, he has been very successful in one particular endeavor here, which is exposing the wasteful and ridiculous spending projects that have been going on. Especially USAID, focusing on that first, I think that a lot of those projects do not seem sympathetic to the average voter. And so
Mhm.
even if they think that Musk has gone too far or they don't approve of his tactics, they have heard that the government is wasting their money on projects that are truly, in some cases, quite ridiculous. And that message has gotten through, and our survey data, I think, measures that clearly.
Yeah, and one thing we talk a lot about on the show here is also government regulation of businesses, which you sort of got into the uh, from the angle of you know people thinking about what would happen if we increased taxes on corporations and whether that would create as many jobs. Um, and we have some people in American public life who have the assumption that corporations would just be going hog wild, perpetuating fraud and poisoning their customers and dumping toxic in water. If there weren't 10,000 detailed rules for every industry that they had to follow, put forward by the government, or as my colleague Wayne Cruz likes to call it, the 10,000 commandments. Yet in your question number nine, there was at least a clear majority, I think 54%, who said that too often government regulation of businesses does more harm than good, which kind of surprised me. I thought that there would be more people who would say, again, without any more detail in the question, like, should the government do more to regulate businesses? They probably say, yeah, probably there's probably more they can do. But at least a majority seem to think that too much regulation is actually counterproductive. So that seems to be a sort of what I think is sort of a healthy skepticism there.
Absolutely. I think that here's the hard thing when it comes to government regulation is each individual regulation on its own, without considering the 10,000 other regulations, or say maybe 500,000 regulations, they're not on their face totally unreasonable. But where they become unreasonable is that you take that one reasonable regulation and you multiply it by 500,000. Then you can't get to Mars. You can't get space exploration. You can't get a high-speed rail train from, northern to southern California, as Ezra Klein and Jon Stewart in that famous, interview detail. We can't solve big problems because we've gotten stuck in this labyrinth of 500,000. Maybe at some point each individual regulation was reasonable, but on altogether they're preventing us from progress and from success. And so something needs to be done to cut that down. And part of it, there's a lot that goes into it, but part of it is the administrative state. That means the federal bureaucracies that you don't get to vote on. People don't have a say in who staffs those agencies, and yet they have more and more power because Congress gives it to them. So we asked people about that. And we found that a majority of people think that the federal government employs too many people. They think that a third of all federal government jobs are unnecessary, not just harmful, just completely not necessary. They're not useful. And that nearly two-thirds said, yes, we should cut the federal workforce. And that's something that's also happening. And I think that that also plays into your point about regulation, is that when you have over 3 million people working in the federal government apparatus, making these types of decisions, it makes it really, really hard for people in the private sector to innovate, solve problems and move humanity forward.
Well, yeah, and I think there's some great research has been done about this. Um, the effect you have, the sort of straw that broke the camel's back effect of any individual regulation might seem reasonable on its own, but the massive accumulation of it creates problems. One of our former episode guest, Patrick McLaughlin of the Cato Institute at George Mason University, he and some of his colleagues have written about this, saying that as we get more and more and more government regulation on private enterprise, it has a sort of negative synergy, right? So we talk about positive synergy, we say one thing and a second thing creates a third force which multiplies it and makes it more valuable. That say in terms of overregulation, it kind of works in the opposite direction, which is, one rule costs $100 million and two rules cost $200 million, but when you put them together, it creates $300 million of like dead weight loss and expenses. So that it's not even just adding up the cumulative burden, which is bad enough, but that whole burden itself creates even more sort of it's been described as sort of regulatory sludge, right? It slows everything down, not just the people it has a direct cost on. And that
Yeah.
has a big, even more, like you said with Ezra Klein and that kind of, viral moment with Jon Stewart, uh, you know, the idea of abundance, which is starting to be talked about more and more, which is um, if we if we don't pare back some of the like government roadblocks in the way of doing stuff, we won't get the things even both people on the left and the right, I think, agree on want, which is affordable healthcare, affordable housing, affordable higher education, um, a lot of but better infrastructure, including clean energy infrastructure and all that. Um, we won't, like you said, we won't get there unless we move some of these blockades out of the way first.
Yeah, and I think ultimately, how is it the case that so many people agree that we have too many blockades and yet they can't yet seem to solve the problem? And I think part of it is that the psychology, it's so easy to get tripped up in the psychology that people get sucked into it and they become part of the problem. And I think it has to do with risk extreme risk aversion. Some risk aversion is good. Not all of us want to be risk takers, right? It's okay for some of us to be more risk averse. But when public policy becomes excessively risk averse, that's when you can't build a high-speed rail train from one city to the next. That's when you really shut down ingenuity and prevent people from discovering and innovating things. And so I think that actually our culture has shifted in favor of extreme risk aversion. Oh, there's something that makes you feel uncomfortable. Heaven forbid. We've got to protect you. We've got to, insulate you from that. And I think that that also extends to regulation as well. And so each individual regulation might actually make sense to some extent. There might be some reason for it. It's like, oh, we're mitigating some risk. But one thing that we don't consider is in efforts to mitigate all risks, what are the risks? What is the risk of trying
Mhm.
to mitigate all risks? Because that is itself a new source of risk.
Mhm.
So that I think would be another conversation, but extreme risk aversion, I think, is at the root of this.
Yeah, and I just briefly I mentioned that some of the work CEI has done about the Food and Drug Administration and FDA drug approvals is sort of relevant to this because the as our former general counsel Sam Kasman, who did a lot of work on FDA policy over the years, I said the easiest way to make sure that FDA never approves a drug that will have any negative side effects is just for them never to approve any drugs at all, right? Because then you'll have zero approval side effects. But obviously, that's not what we want because then we'd have no new drugs and treatments. Um, so, like you said, yeah, too much risk aversion is itself a risk. But I want to get on to the tax stuff before. Well, we still have time because we recently faced the income individual tax filing deadline here in this country in the middle of April, and it's interesting to see what your respondents had to say about these tax questions. Um, and one I thought was interesting. This is again sort of a sort of maybe a class war, culture war angle here on when you ask them what our tax system should prioritize, what sort of goals. Uh, a lot of people said, well, we should try and reduce taxes on the poor or reduce taxes on the middle class. But only 15% said the tax system should ensure that people don't get too wealthy. And I was
Right.
sort of reassured that it was only 15%, but I assume that's mostly Bernie Sanders voters.
Yes. Yes, that is not Americans' primary concern. Really, kind of stood out to me is that the most popular talking point on that was to say to reduce taxes on the middle class. It wasn't even saying reduce your taxes or
Mm-hmm.
to reduce taxes on the most vulnerable people. It was actually to reduce middle class taxes was the thing that was the most pervasive across demographic groups. But you're right, income redistribution is not something that people care that much about. We actually asked a specific question on that, and two-thirds opposed the idea of taking money from the rich to give it to the poor. And I'd like to say something about, in a global perspective, America actually stands out. Our political culture in the United States is different in it how it views wealth and becoming wealthy and rich. So America is one of the only countries, if not the only country in the world that believes that hard work rather than luck is the primary driver of wealth and success in this country. We found 90% of Americans, 9 in 10, says there's nothing wrong with trying to become as rich as possible, to make as much money as you can. And that really is part of our political culture, this idea that you don't have to be born politically connected or wealthy and inherit all this money, that people can go as far as their talents and hard work can take them. And we don't cut down the tall poppies. If you recognize
Mm.
that reference from Margaret Thatcher,
Yeah.
we let our tall poppies grow tall. And so that's really important. And I think that's actually one of the reasons why we have such a thriving technology sector, VC, private equity, all of that is because of that orientation that we have. But there are a couple of groups, subsets, minority, they're not a numerical majority by any means, but a numerical minority that stood out to me on these questions. In particular, people who say they're very liberal. So on a five option choice, are you very conservative, somewhat conservative? People who said they're very liberal. A majority of them um, said that they felt that violence against the rich was justified sometimes.
So
That
that's the
violence
Luigi Mangione question, right?
Yes, yes. 54% of them, a majority. Similarly, 56% of them, a majority, thought that it was good to see successful people fail occasionally. Most Americans, they're very pro success, pro wealth, but this is the seedbed of socialism. Now, what's interesting is that they make up a much larger group of the Democratic coalition. They're not a majority, but about a third of the Democratic coalition comes from this group, and they differ from other Democrats on these topics. There really are some deep divisions within the Democratic Party when it comes to wealth, to success, to luck and hard work. And this group, this is the socialist seedbed.
Perhaps more likely statistically to be university professors as well. Um,
Yes.
so there's some questions here about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So we know that was the big tax legislation from the original Trump administration in 2017, cut taxes. Most of those tax cuts were, but not all, were temporary and need to be if they're not going to expire, then the current Congress needs to vote to extend them. And so there was varying levels of awareness about the TCJA and whether what parts of it were going to be expired or not. And so there's several questions that went into that. That was very interesting. But I think the hammer question was question here number 13. Can you afford to pay higher taxes next year? And 81% said no, they can't. So we can dig into all those other questions, but I feel like that's kind of where the rubber hits the road.
Absolutely. I mean, to be clear, a majority of Americans, a majority have no idea that their taxes are set to go up next year unless Congress does something to either extend or make permanent the tax cuts from 2017. I was surprised to find most Americans just didn't know that the tax cuts were temporary. This is just not something that a lot of people follow. And so for them, this was news to them. And so then we asked, could you afford to pay higher taxes next year? And 81% said no, they could not. Majority say their taxes are already too high. And a majority also said that considering the benefits they receive or what they get from government, they're paying way more than their fair share. And so we've got an issue here where most of the voters don't know their taxes are set to increase. But an overwhelming of that share of them can't pay the higher taxes. And so it's going to be up to Congress. Are they going to be able to come up with solutions where they can make the spending cuts necessary in order to make those tax cuts permanent? Because if they can't do that, if they can't find the spending cuts that they need, then they're not going to be able to secure these tax cuts.
And there's also a few more sort of details here. I guess they wouldn't be minor details if they affected you personally, but um, the questions about um, aspects of this text. So there's the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act period, and we if we want to extend what was actually specifically passed in 2017, but then there's a couple new provisions that Trump and Republicans have come along with and said Trump in the sort of closing days of the campaign made a big deal about tax on tips, right? And then has even after the election he was in Vegas and there was a big rally that was all organized around the idea of eliminating tax on tips, and so this question about, should we eliminate taxes on tips for, servers, hairstylists, and other tipped workers? We had 61% said we should, and 37% said we should not. Um, it's funny because this is one of those ones that came out of kind of left field for me, where a lot of the other debates about major tax changes are things that have been debated, whether they've been passed or not passed. We've debated a lot of these things for the past 30 or 40 years, whether it's, expensing capital for, business investment, or should we have a higher or lower rate on this on higher earners? Should we have higher or lower rate on lower earners? Should we, have an earned income tax credit? A lot of the major things we talk about have been talked about for a long time, but the tax on tips, I'm not sure I've ever heard anyone talk about eliminating tips from taxation before last year. Um, So given it's sort of, nestled into all these other questions about kind of related topics, what did that kind of like tell you?
Well, so what we did is we tried to do our best to give the for and against arguments for taxes on tips. So we found 61% agreed with this idea that we should eliminate taxes on tips because it's important to cut taxes on servers, hairstylists, and other tipped workers. The alternative, though, which 39% agreed with, was that we should not eliminate the tax on tips because it is unfair to only cut taxes for some workers. Instead, taxes should be cut for all workers. So I think there's a couple of things at play. I was curious. This actually made me want to ask some more questions. Do people think that bonuses should be taxed? Maybe there's some element where they feel like, look, you went above and beyond. This is really measuring your effort to go above and beyond, and we shouldn't tax that. Maybe that's the idea. This idea of reducing taxes on some and not others, that just didn't seem to resonate. And it might also just be that the types of jobs that people are working in which they're receiving tips are lower paid jobs, and people are basically thinking lower the taxes on lower paid workers. So that may also be part of the psychology of what's going on here. What was interesting is that Democrats were actually more opposed to eliminating taxes on tips. Republicans were the most supportive. And the reason I say this is interesting is that both the Democratic presidential candidate, Kamala Harris, and the Republican candidate at the time, now President Trump, both said this. So you
Right.
would think that both Democrats and Republicans would have a reason to follow, the leader, if you will, and to support that. But that's not exactly what we found.
Yeah, it's interesting that there's the sort of psychology behind this. Like you said, if you take, for example, like a bonus, should you have to pay income taxes on a bonus? If that is supposed to be the most sort of merit-based pay we can think of, that's the thing you sort of earned the most because you got this special extra payment for it. I know when I worked at the Tax Foundation many years ago, one of the things that whenever there was a big lottery jackpot, whenever it would, the mega bucks got really big, we would get a bunch of questions about what are the tax rules about taxes, and so we would, have to sort of like dig into that every once in a while. And one thing that's interesting is that for states, most states have a state income tax, and every state is taxes it slightly differently. And so if you win a jackpot, you're almost certainly going to be at the top marginal rate in any given state. But what I noticed is a few of those states exempt lottery winnings from taxation entirely, right? So
Oh,
California, which has one of the highest marginal tax rates for individual earners, and normally if you were, say, a multimillionaire Californiaite, you would always be paying at the very highest rate. But if you won the mega bucks, you would pay zero, which I always thought was funny because it's sort of the opposite of a bonus. It's sort of free money that fell in your lap. It's the least merit based of any possible compensation. Yet for some reason they decided you get away, you get it all, you got to take it all home. At least at the state level, you still got to pay the
so
feds.
I actually, you would know better than I, but I know that better than yeah. So when I was growing up, I'd always heard that if you won the car on The Price is Right, for instance,
Mhm.
that I was told, well, you'll have to sell the car in order to pay the taxes that you have to pay for winning the car on The Price is Right. So it's actually not that great to win because now you have to, you have a new project on your hands to pay the taxes.
Yeah, you gotta report that, and there are a couple of interesting details when it comes to sort of like high tech employment or these sort of startups where they want people to spend as much time in the office working long hours, and so they give them these benefits, like they get free meals, like if you go to the cafeteria and you get unlimited free meals in some the fanciest big tech offices. There have been IRS cases about whether you should have to report the cost of the meals as income because it's part of your job. And so some people have sort of run afoul of that, and there's been ongoing debates over the free benefits at the office, whether you should have to pay taxes on them as if they were the equivalent of cash compensation. Um, but we could have a whole new poll about that, about what we think the fairest tax policies are. That would actually be kind of fun. We should I'll hook you up with the Tax Foundation people, and we can find a grant to do that full poll.
That would be
Um,
fun.
Emily, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much. We love that you have your finger on the pulse of the American nation. And as much as we all love making assumptions about politics based on the vibes from social media, it is useful to have some actual statistics and data about what people are thinking. Um, so thank you very much for being with us, and make sure and let people know where they can find you online and find all your latest work.
Yes, thank you so much. It was great to join the show, and you can find the full poll results, the methodology, the full question wording at cato.org. And you can also find some of this on following me on X, which is at Emily Ekins.
All right. Thank you so much, Emily.
Thank you.